All right, kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone. Ngā mihi o te ahiahi. Welcome along. It's a real pleasure to see such a big group here this evening for a lecture on intensifying strategic competition, the new normal for US-China relations and what it means for the rest of us. And it's great to see a big crowd because it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome back to Wellington a very distinguished visitor and a long-term friend of the Centre for Strategic Studies and Victoria University of Wellington, Professor Bates Gill. Bates, I think, is known to many of you in this room, but he is a professor in the Department of Security Studies at Macquarie University in Sydney. He is a fellow of Chatham House in London, and some of his previous roles including being the Chief Executive of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, and he was the Charles Freeman Chair in the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. So Bates has a very long and very distinguished career with many prominent prestigious roles, but the one that we here at Victoria are very proud of is that he was our 2016 Sir Howard Kippenberger Visiting Professor in Strategic Studies. And he was an absolutely exemplary chair, dutifully toured up and down the country, sharing his insights with us on what was then becoming aware of a changing China. So tonight we're delighted to welcome Bates back to Wellington and to help us understand the change and the dramatic changes that are taking place in US-China relations and what some of those changes mean for Australia, New Zealand and the rest of the region. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Bates Gill.
Good evening. Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate that very warm introduction, and it's great to see so many persons able to take some time out of their busy schedules to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and I think it's going to be a subject of increasing, I suspect, of increasing interest to all of us in the coming years in the trajectory for U.S.-China relations. Let me begin by thanking very much David, his whole team at the Center for Strategic Studies and at the university, as well as friends at the New Zealand Asia New Zealand Foundation, for their warm hospitality and bringing me over to meet with so many old friends and to meet a lot of new ones as well. So thank you very, very much. So this evening, take maybe 30 or 40 minutes. I don't want to take too long. I really want to try to get to a Q&A as soon as we can. But just talk a little bit about what my take on where I think U.S.-China relations are going. In a word or two, I would just say not well. And I think we have, as you can see from the title, we should be expecting even greater strategic competition going forward. And as I'll try to get into a little bit more in depth, this is so, I would say, almost regardless of who is in the White House and who is in Zhongnanhai. So there are, I think, certain structural aspects to this relationship that have been building up over the years and which I think are going to be with us for some time to come. And these structural factors, I think, sort of underlie and drive what's going to be continuing strategic competition between these two countries for the foreseeable future, near to medium term, certainly. So that's what I want to get into and try to drill down on that and why I think that way, right? So just a little quick presentation outline, a little bit of broader context that's happening beyond the bilateral relationship, which I think is also important for us to take into account. As a specialist, I think you can all be sympathetic. We tend to, look at trees and not the forest all too often, but I'll try to give a little bit of forest and then go through these aspects of competition, structural competition that I see emerging in the relationship, which will have enormous implications for countries in this region in particular, but I think even at a global level. So here's some forestry, I guess you could say. You know, the competition that we see between the United States and China today obviously does not take place in a vacuum, and, you know, I think is driven in part by the larger context of what's happening in Asia. I think we can all agree, more or less, that the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, Asia, whatever you want to call it, is the region's most dynamic of the world, is the region that is the most dynamic in the world, certainly economically, but I think in many other interesting respects, whether it has to do with sort of simmering security tensions and other political and diplomatic challenges. It's a region which is going to really be, I think, the center of gravity for world affairs for many, many more decades to come. And I think it is that importance then, and its importance to the United States as well as to China, that helps to drive much of the rivalry we see. As each of these great powers, superpowers, China and the United States, wants to take greatest advantage, draw greatest benefit, try to leverage their relationships in the region to their own advantage. And that, in turn, contributes to the strategic rivalry between the two as they seek to sort of dominate or come out on top in this very, very vibrant region. You know, it's also true that U.S.-China rivalry is nothing particularly new. I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed from 1949 to the present to count on more than one hand the number of years where you could say that the two countries had a, normal, trusting, strategic partnership. So, we've been here before where the relationship has had troubles and difficulties, but I do think that, as I'll get into, there are certainly some structural aspects to that rivalry today which make it a lot more difficult. And then finally, what we're seeing, I think, is a real shift as a result of these rivalries in sort of the public moods, if that's the right word. I think you can probably use that term pretty well when you refer to the United States. Certainly, if you more narrowly define the public view as that represented by, let's say, inside the Beltway governance and hangers-on within the Beltway. And then even in China, I think there is a certain souring, I think. There was always within China sort of underlying mistrust, if that's the right word, or an underlying concern, that the United States, at the end of the day, has peaceful evolution of China as its ultimate goal. But I think even within that general frame of mind, there was a fair degree of openness and willingness to find cooperative solutions, a willingness to work together to resolve problems. I think that universe of the possible in China is also getting smaller and smaller. And so even where there could be areas of cooperation or common ground, the politics aren't good for it in either capital at the moment, I don't think. And in other words, maybe to put it more sharply, I would say that increasingly the two sides view each other in more adversarial terms than they have even in the past 5 or 10 years. So in that context, sort of with some of those larger issues that are unfolding, I think we can turn to then talking about what I see as these critical structural changes across 3 important elements of the relationship, which are really with us for, I think, to stay for some time. And that's going to then underpin this intensifying strategic rivalry that I'm talking about. 3 areas. First, economic and technological competition. Secondly, security competition. And third, we'll talk about what I've called ideological competition, but I would be very open if others could provide me with a better term than that. But let's talk about economic competition. Of course, these two countries have competed, but I think the nature of the competition today is changing and changing in ways that make this aspect of the relationship, an aspect of the relationship which has, of course, traditionally been a kind of safety net, right? It's sort of been the area of last resort that was going to preserve the relationship and stabilize it, because both sides saw enormous benefit in their economic relationship with one another. That safety net is fraying because of the structural changes that are occurring in the nature of the competition. And I list here a couple of reasons why I think that way. I mean, we're all familiar with how under Xi Jinping in particular, we've seen a kind of re-embrace of the state and the role of the state in driving that economy and even sort of exporting that model in various forms and ways abroad. And in doing so, I think, is seen then as unfairly competing with more market-oriented economies like the United States. And I think frustratingly for the United States, doing all of this in a way in defiance of supposed free market principles, which seems to be working, succeeding. So that's, I think one problem. The relationship is less complementary. I mean, as China goes up the value chain in its productivity and its manufacturing, and et cetera, it increasingly becomes a competitor with the United States rather than being a complementary economic partner with the United States. Getting into areas where the United States had been traditionally a world leader and showing signs of maybe even overtaking the United States in many critical economic areas in the decades ahead. And this is what I mean by an aspect of that economic competition seems to be increasingly centered on technological competition, and especially so in cutting-edge technologies of 21st century prosperity, like artificial intelligence, in nanotechnology, in computing, and in big data, quantum computing and quantum technologies, of course, 5G, and other really important areas for economic growth going forward. It's not a matter of China simply being a link in the value chain for American benefit in producing and selling those technologies, but becoming a direct competitor to the United States, and not, in some cases, not just a competitor, but a world leader in these areas. Much accusations and acrimony and hand-wringing in the United States over how China got there, of course, which often includes a lot of accusations about industrial espionage, intellectual property theft, and the like, again, adding to this idea that, China may be successful, but it's done so sort of in unfair ways, not good cricket, and getting to where they are, not on the basis of free market principles, but on something more nefarious. An article that just came out in the Washington Quarterly by Evan Medeiros. Many of you would know Evan, formerly the senior national security advisor for Asia to President Obama, now at Georgetown University. He's got an article in which he makes the case that on top of all of this other stuff in the economic competition, that virtually any aspect of economic development or economic initiative or economic effort on China's part is increasingly seen in Washington through a security lens, So, I mean, there are those, that's what this decoupling is really all about. The notion that you would decouple from the Chinese economy because any assistance, any form of cooperation with China, even in the seemingly most benign areas of say, economic cooperation, only leads to building Chinese power, and which, of course, China is going to use contrary to American interests, or so the argument would go. So the securitization of Chinese economic activity, securitization of how we interpret Chinese economic activity, such as the Belt and Road Initiative or the Made in China 2025 effort. These are not merely economic and infrastructure development programs. These are programs, in this view, which will strengthen China as a security actor and as a challenger to American leadership and primacy. So, these are big changes, in the way that the United States and China look at one another, how they look at economic growth, how they look at the value and benefit of economic interaction and competition, and in general, it's moving in a quite negative direction. And I'd be very open to hearing views, but I don't see how such, in-depth problems are going to be readily resolved going forward. And it's really, as I said at the beginning, most worrisome to me because it has always been the case that it was in the economic realm where the benefits outweighed other problems that we've traditionally had with China, whether it was its form of governance, human rights, assertive behaviors around its periphery. A lot of that could be forgiven, or at least overlooked, or weighed in the balance in a way that gave it less priority because the economic benefit was so great. That whole way of thinking about working with China is a thing of the past. It may come back at some point, but not anytime soon. And that's a real problem, because that had always been a sort of safety net. A second area of competition that I think is becoming more structurally embedded in the relationship, I would sort of put under the general rubric of security competition. Now, once again, nothing new. We've gone to war. The United States has gone to war against China in the past, and there have been plenty of close calls since with China, including, of course, concerns that go beyond, kinetic conflict to problems around nonproliferation and other security concerns we've had over the years with China. But it feels very different now, and I think it does for a number of reasons. Whereas in the past, when China was in a weaker position, I think it was prepared to back down or to, sort of, if reluctantly, at least, acquiesce to or lie low in response to American concerns related to security issues. So, not push the envelope too hard in cross-strait relations, for example. Not push too hard on territorial claims with regard, vis-a-vis Japan. And certainly not try to assert quite grandiose claims to Chinese territorial sovereignty over vast swaths of the South China Sea, and to back that up with, military assets to presumably protect those claims. China today is far more capable, and it appears far more willing to challenge the United States militarily, or at least send the signals that it is prepared to do so around a lot of very sensitive issues and areas that the leadership in Beijing knows fully well. The United States, over which the United States would have interests and even treaty commitments in the case of Japan or the Philippines. That's something quite different that's something very new. And I think it's in part arisen because China can, it's built up aspects of its military in ways to make it more capable of posing these sorts of challenges. But I think it's also a reflection of Xi Jinping's leadership itself. This fellow has big ideas, big ambitions, and I think he's serious when he talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and doing it sooner rather than later. So you have both a sort of technological or capabilities aspect to this, which has grown considerably in the last 10 to 15 years, plus a sort of political will overlay represented, in the person who's leading China today, but which I think is not just him, but I think reflects a growing confidence within China about what it would see as a reassertion of Chinese interests, a regaining of China's rightful place as a regional and even global leader. I won't go into too much detail on this third point, but I've been doing a lot of work of late looking at the PLA reform and reorganization, which has been underway over the past 4 or 5 years. And while, you never know where these reforms and reorganizations are going until the shooting starts, I suppose, unfortunately. But, on paper at least, and in terms of how the PLA is attempting to organize itself, and in terms of just raw capabilities, the PLA is making remarkable advances. And, any American or Japanese or Taiwanese or Australian war planner who isn't worried and isn't thinking very carefully and cautiously about what can and cannot be done within the first 100 miles or so of the Chinese shoreline, they'd be crazy. I think there has been a significant alteration in the sort of the balance of the possible, or the balance of the militarily possible, particularly close in to the Chinese periphery, an area that people sometimes call the first island chain. In that first sort of dotted line there, I think the parameters of the possible for the United States military and for its allies are more and more constrained. And as you can see, that envelops or encompasses parts of the Western Pacific where the United States has bases, where the United States has treaty commitments, where the United States has security commitments of a sort, under the Taiwan Relations Act, to Taiwan, and of course broader interests, so say in the South China Sea, to freedom of navigation and the like. So we are entering a new era in the security competition between the United States and China, and this is not going to change. It's not like China's going to walk back from the first island chain. If anything, it's going to continue to expand its capabilities to project power beyond the first island chain. I mean, the appearance of the DF-26 Guam killer in the parade on October 1st is just the beginning of what China is going to be showing us it is capable of doing. All the while trying to push the Americans back, and of course, install deep questions into the minds of the United States allies in this region about just how far they're prepared to go with the United States should a conflict arise. So real competition unfolding there, I think, and I worry. I mean, I think we're coming up to some very important anniversaries for China. We know that Xi Jinping is likely to want to stay in power well beyond his previously normative limit of 10 years. And I think a part of the reason his party will support him in that would be in the expectation that some of the major strategic goals of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation will be achieved under his leadership. And of course, that includes reassertion of their claims to sovereignty over Taiwan. So I think we're in for a pretty bumpy ride over the next 5 to 10 years. And again, this is a structural aspect. It doesn't matter if Donald Trump is president. It doesn't matter if Xi Jinping is the president. I think this is a confrontation that is going to be with us regardless. And then lastly, and maybe most controversially, we could say, and I'm not as firm in my convictions about this aspect of competition, but I think it's well worth discussing. Because I'm just fascinated by Chinese domestic politics and what Xi Jinping is doing. And it does spill over into how China chooses to conduct itself in the international arena, including in its bilateral relationship with the United States. Okay, it's not new. I think since October 1st, 1949, you could argue Washington has never been real happy about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party runs China. There's always been an element of ideological angst and unhappiness with that reality. Even as the country, China, opened up to the outside world, became more reformed, and we've seen some elements of greater openness and reform. Even when that's happened, I think there was still an underlying concern about the long-term legitimacy and nature of this regime. So that's nothing particularly new. What's different, though, this time is what's happened, particularly, I think, under Xi Jinping. So at the same time that China's becoming a stiffer economic competitor and becoming more capable of competing with and confronting the United States, militarily speaking, around areas of sensitivity to the United States, we've also witnessed this doubling down on the centrality of the Chinese Communist Party to the governance inside China. But here's where it really begins to rub people the wrong way. As a part of that, I would say, rebirth or new centrality of the party in the affairs of state inside China, we've seen I think, significant increase in the empowerment of party organizations to operate abroad and to conduct their activities more actively, sometimes clandestinely, but always with the aim of generating approbation and acceptance of China as it is, not as we might want it to be. And of course, I'm speaking here of the activities of organizations like the International Liaison Department, the Propaganda Department. Sorry, the Chinese English translation of that these days, even though it's the same word, is Publicity Department. I'll stick with propaganda because it has such an important meaning in English. And of course, the United Front Department and overseas Chinese work, et cetera, all central party organs increasingly empowered to operate and resourced, not just politically empowered, but financially resourced to operate abroad, getting China's message out there in various ways, finding friends, finding partners, finding like-minded and supportive organizations and individuals with the aim of legitimizing the Chinese Communist Party and its method of rule and its form of governance so that it can survive into the future. That's really quite new, the degree to which it's been financed and resourced and pushed out to the international level. It's always been there. That's what the International Liaison Department was always supposed to do. That's what the United Front Department has always done, but it's different and more resourced and more active and actually quite more open in many respects. It's again a reflection of this confidence that the party has about its success and its intention to be there for a long, long time to come. The problem, of course, is that this generates competition and conflict and concern within, especially within more liberal, as let's call them, liberal democracies, including the United States and amongst the United States' most important allies and partners around this region. So I'm not sure if ideological competition is quite right, but to the degree we learn that China is, I mean, Beijing denies this, but the degree to which it is seeking to export some aspects of its governance model to other parts of the world, well, then it does become, in a way, a kind of ideological competition between, you know, the traditional Western liberal democratic capitalist model of diplomacy, of domestic governance, of international connectivity and the like, versus one which gives centrality to authoritarian party organizations in the conduct of their international activity, gives priority to state-based forms of economic activity, and of course, overall, seeks to legitimate and make normal the idea that it's okay to have an authoritarian surveillance state, not just in China, but in other parts of the world as well. That's really different. This is a competition of ideas about which form of governance works and which is better, and at the end of the day, for people. And it doesn't help that we in the liberal democratic West are in our own sort of moment of crisis and lack of faith. So, you know, it just has a stronger feel of competitiveness in a way that I don't recall it being, you know, since the opening of the Chinese Reform era in the late 1970s. So across these three areas, economics, security, and let's call it ideas or values, Medeiros calls it governance, we see, I think, an intensifying competition. And again, you know, this isn't happening in some vacuum. This affects all of us. As individuals and as you know, government and institutional leaders, as citizens of our states, this affects us greatly. And you know, I think it's time we tried to, I think we already are, trying to figure out what to do about it. You know, how do we in our own societies manage this relationship, this very important bilateral relationship that's sort of looming above us between the United States and China, but also do so in a way that is true to our own values and interests as nations and as individuals. I have a few ideas here of how we should be thinking about this. You know, standing on one side and hoping this goes away, forget it. This is a show that's coming to you soon, if it hasn't already, and is going to be with us. So I think innocent bystanding clearly is not an option. I know it's not easy for government leaders or institution leaders to come out firmly on one side or the other of this, and maybe that's not the right way to look at it. It's not an either-or option necessarily. You know, either China or the United States. I think that's losing before you even begin. But it's not going to be easy to try and balance these two. But I think, you know, it would be good for societies especially open societies, to have a more intensive debate about this intensifying strategic competition and what it means for us. I mean, I live in Australia now. I've been there for about 7 years. I think Australia, I mean, it's been a pretty raucous debate. I think it's sometimes been underinformed, but nevertheless, it's been pretty intense and pretty wide open, and even at the highest levels of government. Leaders are prepared to recognize that this is a problem, a challenge that Australia needs to deal with. And I think that's probably generally a good thing. I've recently written something for the Asia Society Australia. They did their big Disruptive Asia series this year on China and asked me to write the opening essay. And what I tried to do was come up with a term that would sort of define what is the era that we're going into. And we sort of brainstormed and came up with this idea of bounded engagement. What do we mean? Well, you know, the idea of decoupling or sort of somehow not engaging with a country like China is pretty ridiculous and really not practicable. But what we're going into, I think, is an era in which the parameters of the possible, the possibilities of engagement are going to narrow and become more bounded. It's going to be far less open-ended and expansive than it was, say, even 5 or 10 years ago. And I think if we can think in those terms, that may help guide us forward. You sort of understand that engagement, of course, but there's going to be more restrictions on that engagement. There's going to be less openness in many respects about partnering and engaging with China. But that doesn't mean that, maybe what that means is that maybe priorities about engagement have to move into areas that would be less sensitive but still constructive in the way that a given country wants to relate to China. We see in many capitals these days an effort to try and diversify, to establish new forms of relationships that don't include either China or the United States. You know, trying to find safety in numbers, I guess you might say. And I think there have been a couple of quite interesting examples of that. You know, Japan, India, economic cooperation, Japan, EU, working together. Australia and Japan are stepping up their security cooperation. There's a lot. I'm sure New Zealand has many examples of this as well, and it probably is a pretty wise strategy. Not putting all of your eggs into either the US or the China basket and trying to find constructive and useful forms of cooperation with others. Again, easier said than done. I mean, China is such an enormously important market to New Zealand or to a country like Australia. It's not something you can just diversify away from magically. But nevertheless, I think more thinking about how to build up partnerships with other emerging and important players in the region, like Japan, like Indonesia, like India, and others would be a wise way forward, given this strategic environment of competition between the United States and China that we see coming forward. As I said, it's going to be a lot more difficult. It's not easy. Governments and institutions, I think, will have a hard time with this. It's probably going to require a lot more nuance and sophistication, which is not something you just pick up off the shelf and plug into your current policy and make it work. I suppose I'm always arguing for putting in a lot more resources into understanding China and to having those resources available then to our governments and institutions so that you can tread that more nuanced, if sometimes prickly, balanced pathway to avoid the worst outcomes with China while still maintaining some forms of constructive relations. And as much as I hate to say it, a lot of the old shibboleths and truisms about the United States are going to have to be thrown out the window too, I think. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is an aberration as to how the United States is going to conduct itself in the world going forward. And so maybe, maybe some resources also need to be devoted to doing an even better and deeper job of understanding the directions the United States may be taking, even though those are very uncomfortable prospects for all of us. I say here that if there were a new president, we might see some change in this dynamic, but I don't think it's going to be in the way that you would like, or that many would like in the region. Why do I say that? I was in Beijing a few weeks ago and was quoted by one of the state media as saying that, to their surprise, they were quite shocked that I said this. I said, you guys would be happy to have Donald Trump remain as president. And they were like, how can that be? You know, he's so tough on us and trade and tariff and all that stuff. And I said, yeah, but, you know, he's letting the whole American alliance system collapse. And I don't think he really, you know, wants to go to war with you. And he's easily manipulated. And it's very easy to know what his interests are and to play to them. And sure enough, Anna, the New Zealand journalist, is it Anna Fifield or Anne Fifield? Just came out with an article yesterday or the day before in the Washington Post that said exactly this, quoting senior Chinese officials who said, yeah, Trump's easy to play. But more importantly, I think if we were to get another Republican president, even a Mike Pence, or a traditional Democratic president, I think they're going to come knocking on your door, and on Australia's door, and on Japan's door, and on South Korea's door, and on Philippines' door, and try to revive and do more than revive, but rebuild the traditional alliance relationships in this region, which have sort of gone wanting in recent years, and most particularly under Donald Trump, who see value in those alliance relationships precisely for what they mean for the competition with China, for the long-term competition with China. And that, you know, if that's true, if that's what does come to pass, that's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of capos in the region. So watch out what you wish for if you are wishing for somebody other than Donald Trump in the White House. And I just sort of wrap it up with the obvious. I mean, I think this is a phenomenon that's going to be with us. So we need to, I think, be thinking a lot harder about it, be more prepared for it, and invest the sorts of resources that are needed in terms of personnel and education to help us better respond to it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bates. We've got a little bit over half an hour for questions and answers. So if I could ask you please to, if you try and catch my attention, I'll keep an informal roll around the around the room. And if I could ask you, we're not going to use microphones through the audience, but if I could ask you just to speak up clearly, and if I could ask you please, so that we can try and have as many questions as possible, to try and ask a question and not give a speech. So I'll put the first question as to my colleague, Rob Asen.
Thanks very much. That was systematic and very, very energetic and appealing. I just wonder if I can push you a little bit at the end there, because you kind of depicted the fourth area of competition, which is kind of alliance competition or order competition for the types of, you know, competition for friends, for institutions. And so we hear this about, you know, BRI and you know, various other things, you know. And then, of course, you mentioned the way that the alliance question. And it seems to me that the fact that Mr. Trump isn't pushing the alliance thing, or perhaps almost trying to undermine them, and the fact that China does not really have allies in the same sense, means that we are still quite some way away from a Cold War type situation. Do you think that's right? Because you didn't mention that idea of a new Cold War, but some might feel that your three arguments kind of point to some extent in that direction.
Well, you're right. I didn't utter the words Cold War, which is, I think, a popular meme these days when people talk about the direction of the relationship with China. I don't think it's a good analogy. I mean, I think that, well, to the degree that that term is one that was defined, as the relationship between the two powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, who had every possibility, and actually did conduct, third-party warfare against one another, and not only that, but were literally separated from one another across particularly economic lines, then it's not a very good analogy, I don't think, to what we're seeing with China. If by Cold War we mean something a little mushier, in terms of animosity with one another, some slow disengagement between the two countries, never shooting at one another, so therefore it's cold, but competing across these various areas that I outlined there, well, then I suppose you could say Cold War, but I prefer the sort of former understanding of what the Cold War means. And it's very different. As you noted, China does not have a range of alliances in the same way that the Soviet Union did. China does not even have the kind of influence or suzerainty, if you want to call it that, over large portions of territory, like in Europe, as the Soviet Union did. And I think that's purposeful. I think China understands that kind of competition with the United States would probably be quite dangerous. And so it's attempting, I think, to compete or find ways to compete with the United States that are less controversial and less sensitive. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm happy to entertain other thoughts, but I don't think the Cold War analogy is quite right. And again, another important thing is that even though these two countries are into this quite intensive competition, I wouldn't go so far as to say that China is sort of trying to overturn or establish some sort of a new world order. There's much of the world order that it continues to benefit from quite a bit. And it would even like to be seen as a pillar of those aspects of the world order, like the United Nations. China, at least rhetorically, is probably one of the biggest supporters of the United Nations. So again, it's not, I don't think it's analogous to what we saw between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Thank you. Susan.
Thanks, Mr. Gill. If we take, I guess this is the hot part of the question. If we take lessons from the past, and we would have political, economic and ideological competition mounting to the extent that a military response, even a small one, is considered, why, looking at this, does the US not maybe pull back or try a different tact, especially when clearly traditional alliance partners are feeling uncomfortable to a degree? Does it think it can shape and limit China's rise through its sort of more bellicose response, even though the signs are that it's in some ways retreating from the region? Trump wasn't a PAS and so on. And adding partners in the past hasn't really de-escalated tension. It's typically increased tension, say, with the new president.
With who, I'm sorry?
Adding alliance partners, so we get a new president, and then creating a bigger group doesn't necessarily reduce tensions or create a progressive outcome.
Right.
I guess to shorten your question, it's to what degree does the US think it's shaping China's rise successfully? Right.
I think at the moment there's a great deal of frustration with that idea that no, the ways which the sort of, diplomatic and political leaders of the past thought they could shape China's rise failed. That's really the sort of common theme in Washington these days, right? The idea that there was a naivete in the extreme that I think it's wrong-headed, but this is what people say. That the belief that you could change China through economic engagement and the like has proven wrong. So your question really is, what's the alternative then? What's the big idea then that's going to replace that? And right now, the way it looks, at least among, I would say, let's say the majority of the inside the Beltway crowd, maybe not President Trump himself, interestingly, but I think many other important voices are to push back, and to do it with military strength, revived alliance relationships, particularly with a country like Japan, increased deployments of various military capabilities in the region, more strong assurances and extensions of security guarantees to a place like Taiwan. And then on the economic front, getting out, not doing things that help the Chinese economy. That's where I see the mood going right now. Now, interestingly, I hate trying to gaze into the mind of Donald Trump and try to understand what he might really be thinking. And I'll admit right off the bat that I'm reluctant to give him any credit for true strategic thinking. But I think he probably does represent, to a degree, a persistent but minority element in the American body politic, which is fundamentally isolationist, and believes that America has been taken for a ride and has been unfairly treated, even by its best friends, and that it's time to come home and to work on the problems we've got rather than everybody else's problems. I think that's probably where he would be if we could sit him down, and so I'm not sure I don't think he himself would be all that supportive about a more confrontationalist approach to China, he himself. But I think a lot of people are. And like I say, that's going to create problems out here with our friends in New Zealand, with our friends in Australia, with our friends even in Japan, who I don't think are quite as prepared to go down the pathway of confrontation with China that I think we're going to see emerge in the coming years.
Okay, I've got lots of hands going up now, so I'll try and keep a track of it. I apologise if I will try not to miss you. First of all, Manjeet.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up from where Justice left off. So there are three dominant strands of competition, like you mentioned, between the US and China. And I was wondering, at what point will these become cumulative and tip the scales in favor of conflict? What are the factors that we as analysts should look out for? What stage will this rivalry escalate into a militarized crisis, if you like? And related to that, you also mentioned that, in your talk you mentioned that perceptions have changed in the US and the Beltway crowd, in particular regarding China. What about China? What about the business communities, think tanks, academia, military, and so on in your interactions in China? Have their perceptions changed about the US as well, or are they simply reacting to what they see as policies coming out of the United States?
Well, on the second part of the question, yes, I think there has been a change. And of course, as anyone who deals with China knows, the sorts of people that a person like me can talk to, are 5 or 6 rungs down the decision-making ladder. So, you have to try and interpret what the leadership might be thinking, the real decision makers might be thinking, through this filtered lens that comes down to people like me. So, I don't claim to have any, sort of special insights into what's going on inside China, but I detect a real change in mood and attitude, a willingness to find common ground, and a greater degree of confidence and self-assurance, and increasingly, I would even say, a kind of what's the word I want? A kind of umbrage, almost, with the way China has been treated and continues to be treated by the likes of the United States. And that's fine. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's, I think, understandable given the success economically, particularly of the country. But it affects the diplomatic mood, and it narrows the possibilities for seeking common ground. I think my interpretation of the Chinese body politic these days is that they're in a lot less mood to compromise or to find common ground because they think that the United States hasn't given anything, and China deserves to be treated respectfully, to be congratulated, not criticized for its success, and point to how their success has benefited so many others around the region and even globally, and that should be taken into account, right? So you can sort of understand why they would think that way. Almost a kind of getting fed up with being treated in a second-class way. And that trickles down into the way that conversations are had and the way that compromises can and cannot be found. And I think we're just entering a period of much greater friction and I think potentially volatility, just because the positions are hardening. And as I said in the remarks, if you believe that any type of cooperation with the other side only emboldens their assertiveness, then you're not going to get anywhere. So that's a problem. And I'm sorry, the first part of your question I didn't quite fully.
At what point, what are the factors that might escalate the competition into a conflict?
Right. Well, there's an increased tempo, and this is under Donald Trump, although I don't know how much he had to say in this, but there is now an increased tempo in American activity and surveillance and offshore in the South China Sea and elsewhere. I think the possibility of an accident, a very dangerous accident turning into something more escalatory, is quite possible. I guess I worry a little more over the longer term, the degree to which Xi Jinping feels that something has to change in the relationship with Taiwan. That again escalate. I'm not envisioning any kind of an invasion or something like that, but maybe something like the missile tests of 96, 97, or something of that nature, a sort of shot across the bow of Taiwan separatists, if that's the right word, which would then escalate into something bigger. That's quite possible. If I'm right that the next president is going to work harder to develop a kind of coalition of friends and allies around China, that could spark a real pushback from China, because if we change the nature of the relationship with Taiwan, for example, which the Trump administration has said they are prepared to do, move away from some of the former diplomatic niceties of our relationship with Taiwan to give it, more sophisticated weaponry, boost its status diplomatically in different ways. I mean, that could spark a reaction from China.
Sorry, the gentleman behind you, please.
Thank you. I was just going to pick up on your point around the positive analogy of the Cold War, the Soviet Union Cold War. I suppose one of the elements that made it so visceral was that there was a sense of the ideological competition affecting the homeland. So it wasn't just there was this sort of soft power competition going on out there somewhere. There was a risk of communism taking over in here. So I wonder, do you see that as an escalatory factor in romantic point around could that happen with under Xi Jinping China? Is there any kind of sense that yes, there's a kind of governance model, yes, there's a sort of umbrage factor that is pushing out some type of propaganda or promotion of values. But is there a kind of sense that there's a way of doing things in China that we want to make the US into, in the same way that the Soviet Union kind of got to towards the communism?
I don't see that. And I think it's one of the paradoxes, really, of China's rise, in many respects, is very few, I would say none of traditional, let's call them Western democracies, and I would include South Korea and Japan in that. I don't think there's much appetite at all for the Chinese model. Now, I think that's less true for others who might be, envious that you have a strong state control that clearly has brought about the economic miracle that China has become. A bit of envy there. So I wouldn't call it sort of exportation of communism per se, but maybe broaden it out more. And the phenomenon, I would say, is something more like, the march of authoritarianism. Because we're having our own crisis of confidence, right, in our democracies in many respects. Surely that's the case in the United States. And to the degree that you start casting about for other models, right, this democracy is just way too messy. And so let's get a little more order in our political life so that we can deal with the problems that we have more effectively. And I think that mood, I'm not sure that reflects, I don't think that's something China's seeking to export necessarily, but I think they would find that kind of a world a more comfortable one to operate in because there would be less approbation about them, right? And how they conduct themselves and how they treat their citizens and the like. And so I think that would be a world in which Beijing would be a lot more comfortable. And to the degree they can hold up that model as being a success story, then that probably benefits them. But I don't see them, they don't have a Comintern. I don't see them trying to actively export such models, and they claim that that's not what they're doing. That every country, has to decide on its own how it's going to govern itself. But that said, we know that China, the country, the government, does export tools, at least, and ideas of how to have a successful economy under the conditions of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian rule. So it's a mixed picture, but I don't think they're going to be, just to get back to your original question, I don't think that we in the liberal democratic West, I don't think there's a lot of appetite for adopting the Chinese governance model.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut off the hands up there. I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time now, just so we get through them. So first of all, Jason Young, please.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed your use of the term bounded engagement. And I was wondering if you could explain the expectations on New Zealand and Australia's engagement with China going forward.
Right.
and whether or not it goes both ways, whether or not there would also be expectations from China on New Zealand and Australia.
Right, we'll take one more question at the same time while you think about that very difficult question. The gentleman at the back. Yep, you. Yep.
Would China's treatment of the Uyghurs come back to bite them? Detention camps and
I'm sorry, would China's...
Detention camps for the Uyghurs, will it come back to bite them? Okay. So, and we'll take one more question. Who was it? This lady here, please.
Actually, the gentleman in the back stole my question.
Okay. That's
I was going to ask its effects on particularly ideological competition in China's attempt to accumulate more soft power. It's been quite a slow burn so far, even though it is such a potentially huge human rights issue. You see it becoming more of an issue.
So the question on bounded engagement and then a question of issues around the mass detention of Uyghurs, how is that affecting China's soft power?
Right. Well, I think we already see underway, certainly in Australia, where I'm following it most closely, and I have to admit a fair bit of ignorance as to how New Zealand is dealing with this. But we see, concrete steps being taken to narrow the parameters of the possible in the relationship with China. I think there's a great deal more sort of realism, certainly within, let's call it the, national security crowd in Australia. Serious efforts underway to restrict and narrow the parameters of the possible for engagement with China. And I think it's even beginning to creep into elements of the business community as well. I suspect that's going to continue. And while I think because of the importance of China economically to Australia, there are the occasional efforts by the government to sort of show good faith or demonstrate an interest in a positive and constructive relationship with China, just so that China will not lower the boom. I mean, remarkably, I think by certain indices, Australia is one of the most dependent countries, economically speaking, on China. So it's quite remarkable in some ways that China hasn't lowered the boom when you consider some of the steps they have taken, like the new security laws and foreign interference laws, some of the statements that the leaders of the government have made vis-a-vis China. So I think we will see a sort of narrowing of the parameters of the possible with China going forward. Then we have a question about the Uyghurs, right? I'm sorry, the Uyghurs, is that right? Well, it's been pretty shocking to me that what we think we know about what's happening in Xinjiang and the lack of response from the international community. I don't know where to pin the blame for that exactly. I think in part it's because what's happening in Washington, Washington would normally sort of be the first to speak up and try to mobilize international coalitions in response to this type of thing, and that leadership is pretty sorely lacking at the moment. But I am also shocked that very, very few others, governments at least, have been prepared to speak out very strongly about what's happened. That's surprising to me. But maybe that just tells you the degree to which we've all become sort of engaged with China in ways that we don't want to upset the apple cart, which is precisely what the Chinese would hope. So I find it pretty worrisome. Whether or not, I think you said, could that change?
Will it come back to bite?
Well, I guess it could come back to bite them in a couple of ways, right? It could, but I don't think either of these two or three pathways are likely to happen in ways that are going to be seriously detrimental to China. I mean, one that you might have expected would have been some sort of response from the Islamic community. But of course, the problem there is that many of the leaders in the Islamic community have their own concerns domestically with radicalized elements of their society. So, you know, they may have some sympathy for what China's trying to do. So I don't suspect that there's going to be much backlash there. And of course, the West has been relatively quiet on this. Pretty anodyne sort of statements of condemnation about what's happening, even though, you know, with the release of the documents and they allowed film crews, the Chinese allowed film crews into those camps earlier, before the international program began to build. So even with all of that evidence in front of us, we've been pretty silent, pretty quiet. I was saying to somebody today, I mean, I know this might get me in some trouble, but you know, what if they were rounding up Christians and putting them in camps? Do you think the international reaction from the West would be a little stronger? I think probably so. So, you know, that's very cynical on my part to say that, but I do think that that may well be one of the factors here in the lack of response from the sort of mainstream Western governments, and it's very worrisome. You know, the only other sort of backlash, I suppose, that could occur, could emerge from within the Muslim communities, the Uyghur community in China. But, you know, I think that's not likely because of the controls that they exercise over that community. So unfortunately, I think this is going to be with us for a while.
This gentleman over here, please.
Thanks, Professor Bates. My research is about how can countries make the transition from developing to develop. And my motivation, maybe at least 5 years, has been that if China and Russia couldn't make the smooth transition to developed status, the world would be in big trouble.
Would be in trouble.
Yeah, in big problems. So that's, I think, maybe the most important strategic issue of the world in the next 3 decades. Do you agree with that point?
Okay, thank you. And Les.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about Hong Kong, which I think you haven't mentioned. How worried do you think Beijing is about what's going on in Hong Kong? It does at least seem to show that once public protest starts, it is much more difficult to control, even in a society like Hong Kong's, which of course is a bit of a mixed case, than we would have expected. But is it more than that?
Right. Yeah, now if I understand your question correctly, you were saying that when China becomes a developed country.
Yes, that's why I asked you when you spoke last time at Hunter Council in 2016. But now, I mean, if China and Russia couldn't make the smooth transition, the world would be in big trouble. That's my motivation for the research. And do you agree with that point?
I think you could argue it both ways, to be quite honest. I mean, I think a part of what we're seeing, the things that we don't like about China today, you know, its authoritarian nature, its, you know, its reaction to or creating the problems that we see, helping create the problems that we see in Hong Kong, you could argue are a sign of its weakness, and that were it more confident and more respected and seen by the international community as an acceptable and positively contributing part of the international community. I mean, if that were all to play out in a smooth way, I would not see that necessarily as a bad outcome for the world. So you could weave scenarios whereby a more developed China emerges in ways that are stabilize. You could. But I take your point that, maybe, if it emerges in a way that, sort of firmly establishes the authoritarian model of governance as the more preferred, or brings about a degree of confidence to the Chinese leadership that it, tries to upset status quos around its periphery, like Taiwan, most importantly, then that would be very dangerous. It could be very, very dangerous for the international system. So I think the question you raise is a very good one. If their trajectory towards developed country status continues, is that going to be good for the world or bad for the world? That's what you're asking, basically. And I think there's a valid argument to be made that is going to be a more dangerous world, I think. I'd like to believe that that's not the case, but I think you could argue it both ways. The Hong Kong situation is really very, very interesting, I think, and it reinforces for me this understanding of China that I think we all need to keep in mind. And I realize that maybe much of my presentation did not keep it in mind, but there are real weaknesses there, right? I mean, it's not this all-powerful juggernaut that's going to run us all over and take over the world. It's got some major problems, and Hong Kong is just one of them. Or what I should say is what's happening in Hong Kong is reflective of a kind of weakness or lack of certainty, which of course the Beijing regime does not want us to see or believe, but I think it's there. And for all of China's power and for all of its economic growth and for all of its continued march towards developed world status, as analysts, I think it really is important to remember that there's some huge problems. And that may well be why. I mean, I think it does go a long way to explaining why Xi Jinping is taking the decisions he's taken to reassert a more authoritarian and party-centric model for Chinese governance, not because he's confident, but rather because he's scared. That if he doesn't do that, that the country is at risk of fraying. So, and maybe Hong Kong is one example of that fragility, is that the word? Or lack of unity, lack of support for the direction that Xi Jinping has chosen to take the country. So I guess I sort of see Hong Kong through that lens. That it's a reflection of unhappiness and lack of support within China. And I think Hong Kong is part of China. It's a special part of China, but it's a part of China. And they are not going to go quietly into being absorbed by the mainland. And they're not the only ones, I think, in different parts of China who don't necessarily like the direction that the country has turned, China, in recent years. So it's, I see Hong Kong as a symptom of a larger set of problems which Xi Jinping has chosen to deal with through greater authoritarianism. And we'll see whether he succeeds at that. If Hong Kong and what's happening there is any indication, it's not a done deal for the Communist Party.
Well, on that note, we're after 7 o'clock. My apologies to the many people who signalled that they had a question in mind. I'm sorry. It's perhaps the greatest compliment you can give a speaker, that there were still plenty of questions still to be asked. Perhaps you might have a chance to ask Bates the question afterwards. But I think you'll agree we've been treated to a really stimulating discussion tonight, a really interesting framework for thinking about this intensifying strategic competition that's coming. And listening to Bates, I was sort of reminded of Trotsky's maxim that you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And for us, you might not be interested in strategic competition, but strategic competition is interested in you. So this is something we're going to have to live with for the foreseeable future, and perhaps there's an opportunity to have Bates back to talk about this again at some point before too long. Please join with me in thanking Professor Bates Gill.